Welcome to A State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. I'm recording this here in my office, where I work as a trauma-informed therapist, helping individuals and couples. I also teach mindfulness and meditation, as well as breathwork, and I offer legal psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about this and other offerings, blog posts, resources, and information on my website, stateofmindcounseling.org. And it has been brought to my attention that this podcast is woefully underrepresented on Spotify reviews. So if you're listening to this, consider listening to the episode on Spotify and then leaving us a 5-star review. That would be super appreciated. Today, I have the good fortune of speaking with my friend, the Buddhist teacher, Lama Mike Crowley. This is his second time on the podcast, so if you're new here, please consider going back in time, go back through the archives, back to episode number 71 in our first conversation. So I'm going to take advantage of this intro to share some of my thoughts and reflections around two subjects that are very dear to my heart, which are psychedelic medicines and their potential use for healing, transformation, even awakening, and the Buddhist traditions, their teachings, their practices, and the roadmaps that they offer us. I realized after talking to Lama Mike that there is a lot more I could have said on this subject, so I do hope to have him back again sometime in the future. But one thing I feel I should share is that Mike Crowley's work, discussing psychedelics as being a historical part of the Buddhist traditions, especially the Tantric traditions, is controversial and is not a mainstream view in traditional Buddhist circles. Now that may be changing through his work and through the psychedelic renaissance that we're in and all the scientific research and interest in all things psychedelic these days. But the fact is that, generally speaking, it's not a mainstream view. One of my main Buddhist teachers is Chokyam Rinpoche. He is a very revered Lama. He was born in Tibet. He is the son of Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, who is widely regarded as one of the most highly realized Dzogchen masters who left Tibet when the Chinese invaded and began their terrible campaign of genocide and cultural destruction, which unfortunately is still continuing today in Tibet. I don't think that Chokyam Rinpoche would mind my sharing that at teachings of his last summer, he shared his perspective that the point of the Dharma is to realize one's natural state, not an altered state of consciousness. And he expressed doubt and skepticism regarding the use of things like LSD and other psychedelics as part of one's path. And when he shared this, I really do not believe he was holding back some secret teaching or secret part of the lineage, some secret aspect of Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism. I think he was being honest. He said that many years ago he had been offered by a senior student to take LSD with his father. He chose to not do that. And he expressed the view that we are already deluded, that the point of the Dharma is to get undiluted, and that mind-altering substances are a kind of double delusion. So I wanted to just share that out of respect to him and the Buddhist teachings and traditions. And all that being said, I do think Lama Mike Crowley's research and writing and insights on this subject are fascinating. I've really been opening my mind up to the possibility, especially that historically, psychedelics may have been used in early Tantric Buddhist rituals and practices, especially in India. When you look at the stories of the Mahasiddhas, and in some of those stories, it seems like very clear evidence that psychedelics are being used, especially mushrooms. We talk about that with Mike Crowley here in this episode. Also, with all due love and respect to the authentic lineages and traditions, and they absolutely deserve to be carried forth in an authentic and genuine way. They have a tremendous amount to offer us. A lot of the texts and traditions are still being translated. They hold extremely profound and advanced teachings and practices. So with all the love in the world and respect to that, I do believe it's important to be a part of this evolving world we're in today. I'm recording this here in February 2024. We are in a very different world in so many ways, culturally, socially, technologically, in terms of our science, our knowledge. We're in a very different world today than we were 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And our forms of spirituality, of meditation, and of practice need to evolve to meet this new world, to be a part of it, to inform it. I also believe there's enough room in this world for different paths and different tools. Different people can choose things that might be helpful to them at a point in time on their path, and later they might not be helpful. I think we should have understanding and acceptance of that. The Dharma offers us detailed roadmaps that enables us to travel from states of delusion and suffering to states of transcendental insight or wisdom, and to increasingly embody compassion and well-being. A well-trained meditator is not just someone who's put in a lot of time following their breath, or who's spent a lot of time, quote, just sitting. In the Buddhist tradition, a well-trained meditator is someone who has a good working understanding of the Dharma, of the different roadmaps, and who is applying their physical body, their energetic body, and their mental body to engaging in a process of realizing their innate wisdom, which is the union of calm abiding, called shamatha in Sanskrit, and transcendent insight, called vipassana. It's the ongoing realization of this quality of vipassana that makes one's meditation practice authentically Buddhist, in the sense of actually applying the actual teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha to one's own stream of consciousness. Through study, reflection, and meditation, one's consciousness becomes pliable, trainable, adaptable, and able to cultivate increasing levels of well-being and life energy through increased sensitivity to the constant stream of information that the human nervous system is taking in within every given moment. The Buddhist path of gradual awakening leads, theoretically, to a state of continuous and effortless, naturally abiding awakening insight through having direct glimpses of the nature of reality, which is called the truth body of the awakened heart being, or Buddha. So I'd like to take this opportunity to propose translating the word Buddha in the English language into awakening heart being. This translation points to the qualities inherent in Buddha, namely that it is both an ongoing evolutionary process or developmental process, and at the same time it has the quality or aspect of being pure awakened awareness, which is transcendent to relative space-time. Buddha points to the possibility of self-realization of the fabric of reality itself. The Sanskrit word Buddha is typically translated as the awakened one. However, the Buddha really dwells in the heart. This consciousness that is said to awaken was located in India and then later in Tibet as being in the heart in terms of its location in our physical body. And the word, quote, one, in the translation, quote, the awakened one, is not a good translation for a Buddhist concept, because the Buddha explicitly taught that there is in fact no self, that there is no, quote unquote, one here being awakened. Turning our attention now to the subject of psychedelics, the psychedelic experience was described, I believe by Stanislav Grof, as being like getting strapped to a rocket ship and not knowing what direction you're about to blast off in. So it's unpredictable, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you can be well assured that something tremendous is going to happen. There's going to be some big change to your conscious, subjective experience if you take the right amount of a psychedelic medicine. Meditation practice can give the practitioner an increased ability to set a direction and to consciously participate to co-create your experience. Psychedelics can be thought of then as adding fuel to the fire of the rocket ship of your own consciousness. I believe that skillful psychedelic use can be a method or a skillful means in one's path. This is a different argument for the legitimate use of psychedelics as part of your spiritual or meditation path. It's a different argument than arguing that psychedelic medicines were used historically in ancient India or in other places, and then that part of the tradition was either lost or was so secret that most people today don't even know about it. Because the fact does seem to be that the majority of lamas, monks, and nuns practicing Buddhism today don't know about secret psychedelic rituals actively happening in the Buddhist world. It's possible that they're happening on a small scale and that they've been kept so secret that no one knows about it. But what I'm proposing here is a different argument. That we can use psychedelics skillfully as a skillful means and as a way the Dharma is actually evolving with our culture today. Perhaps the contemporary Western-educated mind can be forgiven for questioning having too much of an allegiance to tradition and precedent. It's possible that having too much reverence for tradition can be a doorway through which corruption can enter, by cloaking itself in the magnificent robes of an ancient tradition. The real Dharma is not a piece of cloth. I really believe that we need legitimate forms of the Dharma that are evolving, that are meeting our world where it's at today, and that our world today really does need all the tools and all the skillful means possible to help our collective healing, our collective development, and that this can and should include the skillful use of psychedelics and other consciousness-altering practices. Without further ado, I bring you Lama Mike Crowley. Today with Lama Mike Crowley. Thank you for being on the podcast.
You're quite welcome.
It's great to have you back.
It's actually Crowley, not the same as Alistair, who pronounced his name Crowley.
Right.
Crowley is an English name. Mine is an Irish name with a totally different origin. Comes from Gaelic.
That's right. I remember that. It's great to have you back on the podcast. This is the second time, and you've since come out with a new book called Psychedelic Buddhism, which I've been reading, and it's much more detailed than I realized. It has a lot of great information, details. It's really a guide for people, introduction to Buddhism, but also a lot of background around a lot of different psychedelic medicines, and then a guide to how they could be used in the best possible way for one's journey, right? For one's spiritual journey.
Well, it was actually intended to be two things. One, an introduction to Buddhism for people who'd only just taken psychedelics and not dipped their toe into the ocean of Dharma. And secondly, it was an introduction to psychedelics to people who thought Buddhism was devoid of such things. It's becoming public knowledge these days. The Dalai Lama mentioned something about it last year.
Oh, really?
That it's about time that we Tibetans, he said, fessed up about our use of psychedelics. And there are several other lamas I know of who have used psychedelics, mostly quietly with their students, but some were quite open and public about it.
That's fascinating. I haven't heard that with the Dalai Lama, that the Dalai Lama had said something like that. I'd like to see that.
Who is a very, very great teacher from Bhutan, I believe. He is quite open about his psychedelic use. And then I know of other teachers who, like Chodam Trungpa Rinpoche, when he was in London, before LSD was illegal, by the way, he would tell people that they should try psychedelics, try LSD. And at the same time, he was living with a bunch of hippies, and he would tell certain hippies, you shouldn't do LSD, it's not good for you. And so he was really quite nuanced about his approach to psychedelics.
Yeah, that was a fascinating part of your book. I appreciate that story. I've heard so many stories about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche here in Boulder, Colorado, and Naropa University, and so many of his students here. Yeah, well, I think it's fair to assume that most listeners of this podcast have some familiarity with Buddhism and some knowledge of psychedelics. And so I think it's great to dive in. And one of the things I want to ask you about, maybe we can jump into it right off the bat, but since we're already on the subject, but in terms of psychedelics and Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, it's such a rich tradition with, I think, so many different, everything can be kind of formulaic, handed down and in a very precise way. And so in my experience with traditional Tibetan lamas and teachers and Sangha, there was never any mention or allusion to psychedelics, but there would be some mention of things like sexual yoga practices that were said to be very secret. So they weren't going to be taught here, but it was a known thing that they existed. And it just seems different with psychedelics. I've just never heard personally a lama talk about it or I've seen it historically or, yeah.
Well, psychedelics are a secret, as are most aspects of the Vajrayana. In fact, there's one book, the first book written by a member of the Sakya lineage, which says Vajrayana has 9 levels of secrecy. And so maybe the massive public is only introduced to 1 or 2 levels of secrecy and never gets the full deal, as it were. I, on the other hand, have heard quite a few lamas talk about the use of psychedelics. And my own lama, my own teacher, is one in particular. he was a childhood friend of Trungpa, and they both knew about the Tibetan Dutsi Rubu, the psychedelic pills, which were in use in Tibet. Often, Terma discoveries were made with caches of pills, like a jar full of psychedelic pills, along with the Terma scripts. These are not bruited abroad, as it were, but they're generally kept quiet. But you'll find that some lineages, like the Gelugpa, hardly mention. I have never heard any of them mention psychedelics. But some lineages, like the Nyingma and the Kaju lineages, will occasionally let hints slip about the use of psychedelic substances, like Trungpa did, as I say, and Dzongsar Khentse, who is a Rime teacher. He is not in one particular lineage, but in fact, all lineages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I've certainly heard lamas and teachers talk about psychedelics, but it's usually kind of in the context of it being something kind of new, or that they're interacting with outside of the Tibetan tradition or Indian Tibetan tradition. But I think, like, reading your book and thinking about it, it certainly seems possible, even likely, that especially with the Mahasiddhas back in India, and especially with the early Vajrayana, the early Tantric Buddhism, and the Amrita and the rituals and some of the stories you share in your book of, like, the master peeing in a pot, and making this potion.
Right. That was Nagarjuna. And there are like 3 stories in the book of Mahasiddhas about Nagarjuna, and this is the Tantric Nagarjuna we're talking about here. It seems that there was a 1st century AD Mahayana philosopher, brilliant philosopher, who wrote like the 70 Karikas and other texts about the philosophical formulation of the Mahayana. This is one who lived 700 years later, maybe 600 years, I don't know. And it's a quite different person, although the Tibetans don't distinguish between them. They say they're both the same guy. I somehow doubt that. The book on the 84 Mahasiddhas has 83 Buddhist Mahasiddhas. And then the last story in the book is about a Hindu called Vyali. And Vyali tries for years and years to manufacture the psychedelic and can't do it, until eventually he meets a prostitute who puts a fragment of a red flower into the potion, and voila, he's got the psychedelic he was looking for. But I have interpreted this to mean it was a fragment of a red plant or something, a non-animal living thing, and I imagine that might have been Amanita muscaria. That she added Amanita muscaria to the potion, and voila, they had a psychoactive substance. Now, they apparently, after discovering the secret of Amrita, they left India for an unnamed island somewhere with Vyali his prostitute wife, and his horse, all of whom are said to have partaken of this Amrita, and so were all immortal. Well, they were visited, it says in this last story in the book, they were visited by Nagarjuna, who at this point did not have the secret of Amrita. So Nagarjuna agrees on a swap. He gives Vyali one of his magic sandals, which are like 7-league boots. And in exchange, he gets the secret of making Amrita.
Interesting.
Then there is the story of Aryadeva, who becomes Nagarjuna's pupil. And well, in one part of the story, in the early part of the story, he comes back from his alms round in the local village or town, and Nagarjuna says that he's accepted too much. He's got too much food given to him by the people of the village. So next time he goes, he brings back just one cake encrusted with little crystals of salt. Oh, sorry, sugar. And I interpret this to mean a cap of Amanita muscaria, which could look like a red cake covered with crystals of sugar. And anyway, Nagarjuna also criticized him for this, and he makes another edible substance, which Nagarjuna is astonished at and says, "Where did you find this?" And he takes him to the forest and shows him the site where he found it, and they see the earth goddess arising from the ground. It's only visible from the waist up. Well, I think that is probably a reference to a half-grown mushroom. And Nagarjuna challenges him to make Amrita with it. He does. They both drink their Amrita. Nagarjuna pisses on a dead bush, and it bursts into leaves and flowers. And then Aryadeva does the same, and his bush bursts into leaves and flowers too. And Nagarjuna agrees that it is of equivalent potency. And eventually Aryadeva floats away into the sky and prostrates to somebody while he's like 50 feet off the ground. And that's the last we hear of him. But I think it is quite an instructive passage when it comes to the use of psychedelics in the time of the Mahasiddhas.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, an interesting connection with this idea of immortality, that is present throughout the history of world spirituality, that a great adept or spiritual master can become immortal. And there's that amazing book, I don't know if you've seen it, The Immortality Key, which traces the ancient Greek and then Roman mystery schools and how they likely used psychedelics in their ceremony, and that became like the Catholic Christian sacrament, which was then lost. I wonder if there's a similar process really with Vajrayana Buddhism, where the origins of that Amrita and that initiation may have well been psychedelic, but then it was mostly lost. Because I imagine many like monks or even Tibetans or people who've been in Tibetan Buddhism for their whole life, they might be like surprised. They're like, well, if it is secret, it's been kept secret from me for 50 years. And like,
right. And I when I was in Australia, I tried to interest a book store which had branches in various cities. In my book, and they said, "Oh no, Buddhists don't use psychedelics." Well, I document how they did in the book. If you want to contradict my book, at least read it first.
That's fair.
And
Have you had any conversations or even arguments with lamas or teachers or scholars about your book?
not a one,
Really?
not one lama has said, "No, we don't use
Really?
psychedelics." No. And in fact, my own teacher once said to me early in um, our relationship, I was, in fact, his first student and one of the very first Vajrayana students in the West. And he said to me, some of my students tell me that you use psychedelics. Is this true? And I said, yes. And he said, oh, good. And that's the subject. So he knew, of course, that I knew Trungpa. And
Right.
I knew that Trungpa used LSD with his roommates, and was very critical of the roommates' attitude to LSD. He said, "You're not reverent enough. You don't listen to what it's telling you."
Interesting. Yeah. It's such a
He also
fascinating.
said, when he left for America, he said, "I'm going to teach the Vajrayana in America, but there's one element of it I'm never going to teach because I've seen how Westerners misuse it." And he didn't say what it was, but I'm pretty damn sure it was psychedelics.
Interesting. I mean, that Trungpa is such a fascinating character, and the kind of party line that I heard going to the Shambhala Center and Naropa University and meditation retreats was um, basically like, first of all, cannabis was bad. Alcohol was somehow good for Trungpa Rinpoche, but probably not for anyone else. And be careful of psychedelics because it could take you, you could go crazy or take you off the wrong path. And of course, this was 15 years ago. I think society's attitudes have changed so much. And I imagine teachers now are much more open in general. But for a whole generation, their psychedelic use was kept somewhat secret. I mean, now if you talk to many older Buddhists, they had psychedelic experiences that got them interested in meditation in the beginning. But
Oh, definitely.
then they stopped and they're like, okay, that was the 60s. I'm going to stop now. And that's the kind of cultural attitude that I've seen among that generation. And I think it's shifting now.
Yes, yes. And in fact, when I take students, I have them refrain from all psychoactive substances, particularly alcohol, for the first stage in which I teach them shamatha meditation, perhaps vipassana meditation, and they'll stay at this stage for at least a year when they're doing nothing but taming their mind. Now, when the mind is sufficiently tamed, then it is possible to go on to take psychedelics. However, in the second phase, which is the bodhisattva phase, the Mahayana stage, after you've taken the bodhisattva vow, then I allow them to take an empathogen like MDMA.
Yeah.
Maybe once, maybe twice, but not excessively. Certainly not every weekend. This
Right.
is just something that we keep for a particular purpose, and usually we will practice the four Brahma Viharas while high on MDMA because it's so much easier.
That's amazing. Yeah. And can you share more what that would look like? Are they in their own home doing it on their own, or is it a group setting, or do you give them guidelines of how to set it up for themselves?
It can be in various places. If we can't find anywhere better, it's in their home. But I like to do it out in nature where they're more likely to feel an expansive attitude towards all sentient beings. and they can visualize all sentient beings being in that, whatever beautiful place I've selected. Sometimes they select the place.
Yeah.
I'm actually performing a bodhisattva ceremony with someone later this month, and this is going to be in a state park in California, which I've been to before, and I agree is a thoroughly acceptable place, as it's beautiful and it's very very lonely, apart from us, I hope, and we'll be able to do the ceremony to our heart's content in this.
I love that. So you'll be conferring the Bodhisattva vow and doing Mahayana compassion, loving kindness practice, and
yeah,
that's beautiful. And then the four that you mentioned are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, and meditating. And,
exactly.
One thing that I feel is good to share, for someone thinking about doing this on their own, or it's like, if you're going to sit down and meditate for just 30 minutes, you have an intention to be working with your mind, maybe your body, your energy too, for that time. And if you get distracted, you come back. If I'm going to sit for 10 minutes and meditate on compassion, that's what I want to focus on. And I think a similar kind of principle with a psychedelic experience, if you want to spend at least some portion of that time on those four, on compassion, on loving kindness, to come back to it if you get distracted, because distraction comes up. And I think what you said about taming your mind, like applying that, because if you just, maybe you set up a nice room, a nice space, and no one's going to bother you, and you take MDMA, you will probably feel a lot of love and compassion, but maybe that experience could be more impactful, more meaningful if you have a clear intention to really focus on that, really stay with it for a certain amount of time, really go into it, really work that muscle, so to speak, instead of just laying around.
It becomes easier the more often you do it. And there is, as I've outlined in the book, there is actually a procedure. Instead of just saying, "Oh, I have love for all sentient beings." Well, in the book, I explain that love, in Buddhist terms, is wanting someone to be happy. So you're saying, I want all sentient beings to be happy, but how do you do this in manageable terms? Well, you start with yourself. You say, I want me to be happy. And then when you're satisfied that that you do have this attitude in your mind that you want to become happy yourself, you then expand it to members of your family. You think, I want my parents to be happy. I want my brothers and sisters to be happy. And then you go beyond them. When you're satisfied that you really filled your mind with this intention for your family, you go beyond your family, more distant members of the family, maybe your neighbors in your street, maybe the people you went to school with. And so you expand it till eventually you get to people you don't actually like. And you say that...
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Yes, that's right. Or people who don't like you, actually, by the time you've done this practice, there is nobody that you don't like yourself. But people will persist in having attitudes towards yourself. And then after this, you expand it to animals, to the land animals, to the sea animals, to the animals of the air, the birds and butterflies and so on. And when you covered the whole earth with sentient beings and the beings below the earth and so on, you extend it to perhaps invisible beings in space and other planets, and say, I hope that all beings in all the universe are happy. And then when you are satisfied with that, rest for a moment and start again on compassion, which is wishing that no one suffers.
Hmm.
You can start with yourself saying, I wish that I don't suffer, and then go to your family and say, I hope my parents don't suffer, and I wish my brothers and sisters not to suffer, and so on. And you do exactly the same with suffering and the the wish, the hope that they don't suffer too. Now, the third Brahma Vihara is sympathetic joy, and I often put the four Brahma Viharas in terms of a parent and their children. It works
Hmm.
particularly well with those who have children. And you say, when you see your child playing with other children and laughing and giggling and having a good time, um, you don't feel jealous that you're not having the good time. You feel happy that your child is enjoying itself. Now, this is sympathetic joy. This is joy in the happiness of others, and you do exactly the same, expanding it outwards from yourself, your family, your friends, your neighbors, people you don't know, people who hate you, and so on. You hope that they all have this attitude of enjoying other people's happiness.
Hmm.
And then the fourth one is equanimity, where you're actually you rest in the condition um, of being how you are, of being not happy, not sad, and um, you expand this to the rest of the universe. Um, so that's a brief explanation of the four Brahma Viharas.
Thank you. I love that. Yeah, and that's such a great thing to share, and it's such a to me it's been like foundational to my meditation practice, my spiritual path. I guess I'm gonna use that. It's like to keep coming back to that. It doesn't really matter how advanced you might think you are. To keep coming back to that
Oh
compassionate
yes,
motivation. It's what without that you can't really practice tantra, right? You can't really practice anything else.
absolutely. I totally agree. Without that, the Vajrayana is empty and worthless. You have to have this fundamental um, feeling of connectedness with the whole universe before Vajrayana becomes at all meaningful.
Yeah, yeah, and it seems like such a beautiful gift that Buddhism, of course, other spiritual traditions have beautiful teachings and practices for love and compassion too, but that Buddhism can really offer to people, and especially with something like MDMA, to take that experience, to deepen it, to really touch into something very profound and deep, and then hopefully carry it through in your life. And that's what we need in this world, that care for all life.
Right.
Yeah, well, it seems to me like psychedelic experience could be someone's start to becoming interested in meditation, in a more a more spiritual approach to life. And then, like you said, so maybe that could be like an initial experience, and then it might be wise for them to put that to the side and really focus on, like you're saying, on shamatha, vipassana, taming your mind, gaining some mental stability. And then as you progress with that, you could then make use of the occasional experience. Do you have any just advice or suggestions for people listening, like how often they should consider something like this? Yeah.
Well, when it comes to the Brahma Viharas, um, it's actually included in all of tantric sadhanas. All Vajrayana sadhanas have a brief sentence where they say, and generate the four Brahma Viharas.
Yep.
And next you do, well, it takes at least half an hour to go through all the Brahma Viharas and all the stages, but it's just a line or two in the sadhana. So it's something which I think shouldn't be overlooked. It's a very, very powerful exercise. Of, maybe it doesn't do the rest of the world a lot of good, but it does you it's a very, very powerful tools for uh, bringing peace to your mind. And I only took the explanation of my Dharma path, how I teach my students up to the Mahayana, and I did not venture into the Vajrayana. When somebody does the Vajrayana, they are, I consider them eligible to take a psychedelic. I would advise them to meditate before, during, and after the psychedelic, to put it on its most universal basis. It's not just you having fun; it's you contemplating the rest of the universe while you may be in this elevated state.
Yeah, and obviously the more people who can really tap into a sense of universal compassion and act from that, it will be transforming the world. And that's really the point, I think, of Buddhist practice, right? To transform the world, to have less suffering and more genuine happiness.
Absolutely, totally.
I think when I reflect on my meditation path, that meditating on, may all beings be happy, may they all be free from suffering, including myself in that, it became in part a reflection on what does it mean to be genuinely happy, not just superficially happy. And that's been an important thing for me in my life to reflect on.
Right. And we'll find that real happiness is like sympathetic joy. It's like enjoying the happiness of others. And yeah.
Well, good. Well, I guess part of my question I want to ask you is, do you have any advice around how often someone should have a psychedelic experience if they are a meditator, if they are wanting to engage with it this way?
Well, I've gone from doing psychedelics like once every couple of months to doing them once every couple of years, because the more you take them, the more you familiarize yourself with that perspective, and the more you take them, the less you need them. So
I love that. That's beautiful.
So it's not that any of these are addictive. They are anti-addictive. In fact, if you take them too often, they stop working. And that's absolutely true of the major psychedelics, like LSD and psilocybin and so on. But it is not the case for some substances which people like treat as psychedelics, but they are only psychedelics on a superficial level. That is like ketamine, for instance. And ketamine is addictive, and it can actually. I've known people who've died on ketamine.
Oh my God! Yeah, that's in your book. I saw that.
Right. And I have been criticized for not including ketamine in the substances I recommend in the book. And I've always answered, well, friends of mine have become addicted, and one actually died on ketamine, not of the effects of the drug, I hasten to add. It's just that he enjoyed taking ketamine while in the bath.
Yeah.
And he must have been really out of it when he slipped below the water level. And never regained consciousness.
I actually have a friend who died in a sensory deprivation tank, and the police found ketamine in his pocket of his pants. So that may have contributed to him most likely contributed to him dying there. So you should be very careful with ketamine and any kind of water. Interestingly, I mean, I work with ketamine to some degree in the context of therapy, and it's called psychedelic assisted therapy, and it's ketamine and cannabis are the only legal options for that right now. So I think part of the interest in ketamine has been that it's, when used properly, is extremely safe and it's legal and it can be prescribed by a doctor for therapy, which is great. But I also agree it can be addictive. It should be treated very carefully, and it's an interesting thing. I've had my own experiences with it in the context of therapy, and it's extremely powerful. But it's definitely very different than LSD or psilocybin. So it's its own thing. Yeah.
Well, I've not taken it myself. I only have the experience of others to go on, and it said that you lose contact with the outside world. You're entirely inside your brain, and some describe this as thoroughly enjoyable, and some people enjoy it a little bit too much. Every opportunity they can.
Yeah. Interestingly, it's something that I have never enjoyed that much. I don't feel drawn to it. It's not something I particularly want to do. So for me, it's not addictive, but it has that potential. And I was going to say, it, like a lot of these substances, it can be used on a lighter dose where you can be able to talk. And that's usually how I use it in the context of therapy. But a heavier dose, you will be completely gone. And you do want to be in a very safe space if you are going to do that and have someone there to watch you. I think part of the value with these kinds of things in the context of healing and therapy, healing from trauma, really is, it's just a massive, it can be such a disruption of your normal thinking, of your default mode network, of your normal sense of yourself. And ketamine has that in common with other psychedelics. It's almost like you're going through and the world is always gray and you're always thinking about this thing, you're always seeing things in a negative light. You might not even be aware of that because that's just how you're seeing the world. And the ketamine experience could disrupt that. And wow, there's something else possible here.
Well, that is its upside. That is the benefits of taking ketamine. And of course, while we can be aware of that, we should also be aware of the possible pitfalls, the downside of ketamine, the fact that you can start doing it in small amounts every hour or however often people take it.
It's terrible. Yeah, I think it's good to speak to the downsides, and it's also good to recognize there's a money incentive for some people in the space to promote ketamine because that's their business, and we should be very careful of that. That's a dangerous thing too. So
yes, it's probably used by the medical community as a therapeutic tool simply because it's legal.
Yep.
Not because it's the best substance in that regard. And it's the only one remotely psychedelic, which is still legal for use by the medical community.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, if we shift topics, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with your own teacher. You mentioned him in the book, and part of that is, I think, a lot of people interested in meditation, Buddhism, all these things we're talking about, it can feel difficult to find a teacher or to have that kind of relationship. And I guess part of my question is like the use of modern technology, like online classes, even podcasts, audiobooks, guided meditations to reach more people, and what that teacher-student relationship can look like for people, like what that can mean.
But I recognize the value of online meetings with a teacher if that is the only way you're going to meet a teacher. But I would also at the same time counsel patience and be aware that there are teachers out there. You will find them, and it's really best to have a relationship where you can sit down with your teacher and absorb the teachings that he or she has to give you. The um, you'll get a certain amount of this with the with a communications over the internet or whatever. But I personally think that I only really connect with one of my students when I'm sitting down with them alone, because the more people that I speak to, the more likely it is for somebody to misinterpret something I say,
Mm.
and to go home with a totally distorted view of what I intended. When I'm with a student, I tend to tune into their vocabulary, their experiences, and I'm able to give them teachings that work on a one-to-one basis. If my attention is divided by two students, I have to do a balancing act between what one person understands, what another person understands, and so on. So it's all very well to get a general approach to the Dharma, and a general approach to what is true, what is applicable, and so on. But I think you really need that one-on-one
Mm.
experience to get the full taste of the Dharma.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And for you, I mean, in your case, like you were able to contact your teacher or call them or write them a letter and get personal feedback.
Oh, I wrote letters to my teacher, but he never wrote back.
Oh.
He was quite famous for that, never writing back. But you see, I was fortunate that I met my teacher in 1966, and nobody that I'd ever heard of, maybe there were one or two here and there, but nobody I'd heard of um, was actually studying Tibetan Buddhism.
Wow.
And I spent all day, every Friday with him for the next 7 years.
Wow.
And you see, I worked nights at the time. I was a proofreader, and I worked from Sunday night to Friday morning. Friday morning, I'd go home, have a wash, put clean clothes on, and go and see my teacher who lived in London. And we would spend all day together. Sometimes we'd even go to the cinema together. And I remember going to see the Japanese movie Kwaidan, which is a version of a book by Lafcadio Hearn, in which he presents like several famous Japanese stories. He retells them in English. And I went to buy the tickets and then returned to find my teacher, who was wearing his robes and he still had a shaved head and so on, standing there looking serene and detached. And he bent over and said, "They all think I'm Japanese." which he found very amusing.
Oh.
That was that was how we interacted for the first 7 years. In fact, I was seeing him every Friday, pretty much every Friday, until I one day asked if he would be willing to give me refuge, and that I would become therefore an accepted member of the Kaju lineage. And he left the room, came back with several sheets of paper. I think it was about 6 sheets of paper, and said, "Learn this and come back next, whenever you've learned it." And I stared at it. It was the refuge ceremony in Pali.
Oh my gosh.
I went home. I learned it. By repetition. I didn't understand the half of it. I knew those words, which were similar to Sanskrit words, as I was also studying Sanskrit at the same time. And eventually, when I thought I could manage to reproduce it as crudely as possible, or not as possible, but as as I could at the time, and I went back, and he sent somebody else to the door, saying, "I'm sorry that like Lama Chimi can't see you at the moment. He's busy." And so I was rebuffed on my first appearance, and then my second time next week I went back again, and they said, "Oh, Lama Chimi's not here; he's in Scotland." And so I came back the third time, and the Lama himself let me in and made me a cup of tea, sat down and was chatting with me. And I said, "Well, enough of this. Like, are we going to do the refuge ceremony?" And he said, "Yes, good."
Oh.
And then he went and put his robes on, robes I've never saw him wear before, and I've never seen him wear since, and gave me the ceremony.
Beautiful.
And I was his first student ever.
That's amazing. Well, that's so symbolic, that having to ask 3 times, and
Yes.
beautiful story. Huh. Yeah. Well, I think there's something really special about having a relationship like that with a teacher and seeing them in their more, going to the movies, like seeing them in the more human, not just always in a teacher role. I think that's an important part of the Vajrayana, really, that all aspects of our existence can be included.
Yes, exactly.
That's beautiful. Well, another question I had for you while I have you here is, obviously, you've done a lot of study and practice with Buddhism, with Vajrayana Buddhism, things like the 6 yogas of Naropa, and all these things. Like, do you have any reflections to share about what you feel is really relevant and helpful for people today versus aspects that might be less relevant and helpful?
One aspect I don't find particularly useful is reciting texts in Tibetan.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Very few people speak Tibetan, and even if they do, it's usually in some appalling mispronunciation of it. And so, if only we could translate these works into English and recite them in a meaningful way, that would be so much better, so much of an improvement over the way that they're often practiced today. But then again, it wouldn't have the exotic flavor that some people go for. But I think it would be well worth the while of Buddhism to drop these people who see it as an exotic flower they can wear in their lapel. It's not for personal adornment. It's something that we ought to take to heart.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the words are meaningful, and they're meant to be. Like, if you're saying things like seeing everything as emptiness, like saying that in English, then you can meditate on the meaning and have some experience. And
totally,
you don't understand the Tibetan, and you're blah 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 blah. It's like,
yeah.
It's amazing how the Vajrayana sadhana has all these elements built into it. Like you said, the 4, the compassion, the loving kindness, everything's in there. So if you could slow down and spend a long time with it and go through it all. It's like, yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I guess I'll give another shout out to your book. It has a lot of information. It's a good guide. It goes through all these different substances and things, and then different Buddhist teachings.
Well, it has two main sections. One is Buddhism for psychonauts, and the second one is psychedelics for Buddhists. So if you've only studied psychedelics, well, this is how Buddhism may help you. If you've only studied Buddhism, this is how your practice may be enhanced by using psychedelics.
Yep. Yeah. And then one thing I made a note of to bring up here, because I think it was really helpful, was, a lot of people have heard about the importance of set and setting, and you really explain in more detail what that means. But you give 7 prerequisites that I wrote down: what drug you're taking, what dosage, the setting, your expectations, your lifestyle, and then your intentions that
Yes.
go into that experience with. And so that I thought that was a really helpful list of 7 things to check in with before you embark.
Yeah, you should generally check all 7 and make sure that you're really online with all of them, that you have them uh, all taken care of
Yeah,
before
yeah.
the psychedelic.
The other thing you said in the book that I agree with and appreciate is that there's no dosage of a true psychedelic that can be called purely recreational. There's always the possibility of
Right.
insight, epiphany, transformation, some very unexpected thing. And some of the people I work with in my therapy practice come to me and they'll or show up for a session and they'll say something like, I took what I thought was a very small amount of mushrooms last weekend. I didn't expect much to happen, and I got knocked on my ass, and I need to talk about it.
Exactly. Funnily enough, um, there's some organization I've recently become involved with, as they are, you know, patrons and sponsors of me. They have had several different types of mushrooms, all of the same species, all Psilocybe cubensis, and they've had them all analyzed for their potency. And they found there is actually a 40 fold difference between the
Wow.
weakest ones and the strongest ones. So
Yeah.
you can't take like a teaspoon of mushrooms assuming it's going to be the same as every other teaspoon of mushrooms. Everyone is basically different. And
That's a good point.
another thing which I find interesting is that the while they provide mushrooms for their congregants, the weakest kind of mushroom is the most popular.
Wow.
The strongest ones are used by some people, but definitely not the most people.
Yeah. I think that's significant. I think that when it comes to that moment, there's fear that comes up, and there's a good reason for that. It takes a lot of respect, and
Mm. Well, with a truly potent dose of any psychedelic, not just mushrooms, but any psychedelic, um, you're confronted with the realization that um, the you that you thought existed before you took the drug is not real.
Hmm.
There is no real you,
Yeah.
and this is known as ego death in the literature surrounding this. And it's something that you have to embrace. And if you try and deny it, um, it will come back and bite you on the bum. You know, it's something that you can't deny. You have to accept it as a reality. We are just, you know, part of the furniture, if you like. We are just part of the landscape of our existence, and we can be effective and comfortable part of the furniture, or a a useful part of the furniture, like a standard lamp or something. But when we're not, you know, the we're not the central part of anybody's existence apart from our own.
Wow.
And
Yeah. I think it's good to that's well said, and I think it's honest just to acknowledge there's fear around death for 99.99% of people, right? And even if you think, oh, I want to experience ego death, when that moment comes, there's probably going to be fear, and there's probably going to be that ego that
Yes,
actually doesn't want to die. It's probably
yes,
it's good to
yes,
know that, you know.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Although sometimes there isn't any fear; it just sneaks up on you.
Hmm.
I have sat with many people who have done psychedelics, and I've just been there as a guide, as an observer, as someone they can rely on. And on several occasions, one of these people have said about it'll be about an hour and a half, 2 hours into the trip, they'll say, "Have I died?"
Hmm. Yeah.
And I just have to say, well, no, but perhaps that the less useful parts of you may have died. So just say goodbye to them and accept your new being.
Hmm.
And um, but it's strange how many people have actually mentioned that and have just noticed it uh, as an interesting part of their new existence.
Oh, yeah. That's good. Yeah, I can kind of sneak up and yeah. Well, I wanted another part of the book I wanted to bring up. You share the story in your first book, Secret Drugs of Buddhism, too, and then in this new one. But you had this early experience with psychedelics where you experienced this kind of Indra's net, this interconnected jewels of the universe, and you could
Yeah,
share more about that. But part of what I appreciated was you're really using kind of Buddhist logic to look at it. And you said, one, either this experience I had of Indra's net is something universal and it's been accessed by meditators in the past, and now it can also be accessed by psychedelics in your case, or two, it's only accessible through psychedelics. And that means that the great masters of the past tried psychedelics and had that experience and gave those teachings from that experience. And for me, I would definitely go with number one, that deep meditators could access these experiences and that psychedelics could also reveal them. And that I just take the perspective that Buddhism really is about getting in touch with what's true on a deeper and deeper level, and that it could be experienced in different
yeah,
ways. And it's there to be seen. It's not being created by a medicine. It's not being created by a meditation. If you're doing it properly, you can actually have insight into something beyond that. Do you have any?
yes.
Yeah.
I'm well. I can say that I've tried on several occasions to reproduce that experience,
Mm,
but for whatever reason, um, I was incapable. It did not reappear to me. So I consider that early experience that was only a couple of months after I first took refuge with Lama Chime. I've considered that to be if you like to put it in Christian terms, a moment of grace.
mm,
Of just, I was, blessed by the particular um, influences of the time, of the fact that it was um, at my friend's house in the English countryside, that I had no responsibilities at all, and I was just able to relax and um, become absorbed in the music of Bach, which he was playing on his record player,
mm,
and so um, I just think it was something special to that instant, that moment in time, where with that half hour I had to gaze on this infinite array of crystal spheres, and no amount of trying will actually get you there.
mm, mhm. Yeah, a moment of grace. I appreciate that. Wait, and then, I mean, now it's just a memory, but do you find that with something like that or other experiences like that, that you can kind of keep that memory alive such that you can still kind of feel the experience a little bit and kind of,
You can a little bit, but um, um, I'll give you uh, the perspective from the Kaju um, masters, that they say that if you have a great meditation experience, you can talk it over, preferably with your teacher, once,
hmm,
and then never mention it again. And you bring these wonderful meditation experiences to your teacher, and he says, that's just nyam. That nyam is Tibetan for experiences, or it's just something which occurred once in one meditation, and it's not significant. Occasionally you will say, yes, that's right on. You're perfectly right, but still, don't bring it up again. You had it once, and to repeat it, to keep repeating the story as my account of the crystal net is repeating something that happened once, and the more I repeat it, the more it just gets to be words.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't repeat it, it can exist as it was in its ineffable state, that you can't actually phrase it in words. It's an experience which you've had and which you may be able to share with your teacher, but you'll never be able to replicate by the means of words. It's a difference between the absolute state and the relative state. You can experience something as an absolute, and as soon as you try to put it into words, it devolves into the relative state. So that's what I can say about that.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me. I participated one time in a ayahuasca ceremony with some shamans from Colombia, and then at the end of it, the next morning, they said, "Whatever you experience, keep it to yourself. Don't go around and tell it to a bunch of people." And it was a similar kind of message.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a kind of hallmark, I guess, of Buddhism, like the non-attachment, and it's kind of famous for that. And I think if you really study that, think about it, reflect on it, it's something that could help everyone. So it's, even if you're not interested in calling yourself a Buddhist or getting too deep into that, that non-attachment you're speaking of is helpful. It's good, actually.
Yeah. The only way to proceed, I imagine.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, one of the things about the story that you just shared that stuck out to me was you had no responsibilities. It was like a carefree kind of attitude. Like, I'm in this nice home and I can just relax and no expectations. Right. You weren't trying to have this big experience. You were just totally, sounds like, just really relaxed. And there's something about
that. Absolutely. Yes.
Good. Well, I want to ask you about this thing of psychedelics being secret. It seems that it's not just the Western world or Judeo-Christian values or the war on drugs, but maybe in Asia too, maybe across the world. But it's kind of like, why? And in today's world, they're becoming less and less secret. More and more people are being more and more open. I think that's a good thing. And I just wonder, was it also a part of Indian and then Tibetan, maybe Chinese, and maybe Japanese culture, to anything that could really affect your consciousness was kept kind of secret and kept away from people, and like it was kind of kept for the elites, perhaps, or the initiates, or the.
Well, I think originally the secrecy started with the Brahmins in the period of the Rig Veda, and you see, the Brahmins had created at about 2500 BC. They'd created this new language called Sanskrit,
right,
which is an artificial language made of the 5 languages of the various Aryan tribes who migrated into India at that time. Now, the word Sanskrit means the perfected one, and so they removed all irregularities from the language. There are no Sanskrit irregular verbs. And one thing they did was remove all references to mushrooms from the language.
And I think I learned that in your first book. That's such an amazing thing. How did you learn that? How did you realize that?
Oh, by actually trying to, I've got several Sanskrit English dictionaries, and I tried to look up the word for mushroom. and it just wasn't there.
That's so
So,
amazing. Yeah.
and then eventually I found, well, I've read the laws of Manu, which are the earliest formulation of a legal system in India, which was written up sometime between 1000 and 500 BC. And in it, it doesn't like mention mushrooms by name. Of course, they had no name, but it mentions them um, uh, as these various words which meant um, umbrella, which they're umbrella shaped, or parasol, which was another one. And then the most fanciful of all was the word uchilindra, which means uprising maggoty thing. So it was it was a sprouting maggoty thing, but they didn't dare name it exactly, and they said um, anyone who touches a mushroom is guilty of the same crime as wounding a Brahmin.
That's
And
incredible.
anyone who
Amazing.
uproots a mushroom is guilty of the same crime as killing a Brahmin. And so they had to have like believed mushrooms to be particularly valuable and only accessible to Brahmins, and no one else could touch them.
Wow. Yeah.
So it was that kind of atmosphere um, which Buddhism inherited, and eventually the Vajrayana also inherited this. Let's not be too overt about the use of mushrooms kind of attitude. And as you say, in the modern society, they're available to anyone who can read. You can buy, Shogun's books,
Yeah.
Tikal and Tikal, and find out about the hundreds of psychedelics he created. By the way, he created about 400
Wow.
psychedelic substances, and left a book of about 230 different preparations, which he hadn't had time to do himself, had just
Wow.
written down in a book. And then now the property of a few of his colleagues who are steadily making these substances, and intend to get them registered with the DEA. And
Oh, amazing.
yeah,
That's so
so
incredible.
they're doing it on the quiet in Berkeley.
Well, this,
And
yeah, it's amazing. Well, this picture emerges for me of psychedelics being part of the evolution development of humanity from our earliest days. Terence McKenna had that, stoned ape hypothesis, and then the powers that be kind of realizing how powerful they are and kind of controlling them, keeping them secret to such a point where they even get lost. The knowledge of it at all is like lost to most people. And now we're in a new age, the information age, an age of democracy, across the world is seen as the better form of government in general. And it's a kind of democratization of this knowledge. And just as anyone could pick up a book and read about psychedelic mushrooms and all these things, anyone could pick up a book or go on the internet and read about the tantras, which historically were very secret.
right,
And we're in this
right.
new age. We're in a new world. We're in a new time where this information is
Well,
open to everyone.
except that the tantras are um, hidden in such a cloak of secrecy that I mean, you read one of the tantras, for instance, um, starts like the Hinayana Sutras always start. Thus have I heard. The Buddha was living in such and such a place in the presence of such and such a a selection of his disciples. Then the Mahayana comes along and says, well, the Buddha was living, such have I heard, the Buddha was living in a such and such a celestial place, and in his retinue were bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, mahabodhisattvas, and gods, and they go off into hundreds of followers, including extraterrestrial beings. And then the tantras start with an absolutely scandalous take on this, when they are likely to start, for instance, thus have I heard, the Buddha was at one point living in the vagina of such and such a goddess.
Wow. Yeah.
He was accompanied by these beings. And one of them, the Buddha Kapala Tantra, says, and Vajrapani asked him, well, how do we enlighten the really stupid people? And at this point, the Buddha's head fell off and it rolled around, and a scroll came out of his mouth. And, this is, this sort of stuff is highly symbolic and highly cryptic. And if you have the empowerment, you're given the plain, well, we would say plain English explanation of what these words really mean.
Yeah, fascinating.
So
often that plain English explanation doesn't include anything about psychedelics, right?
Well, if you have a heart connection to your teacher and you spend like day after day with your teacher, just you and him, then he will explain what the psychedelics mean and what psychedelics are appropriate for you to take. And it especially in the Nyingma and Kagyu lineages, where they have secret caches of these substances are revealed, and sometimes the composition of these substances are passed down. I actually have a Tibetan text which I found in a prayer wheel, which is ostensibly by the Bhutanese Terton Pemalingpa. And it's the one text of his which Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche was unable to find when he compiled the list of all the termas known at that point in the early 19th century. And it gives lists of botanical substances, which, if only we understood what these were actually, what they actually were, could probably be used to make a psychedelic now. Unfortunately, they're in flowery Tibetan language, which doesn't exactly say, well, this is a daisy, this is a dandelion. They are very poetic expressions of what the plants were.
Yeah. One of the parts in your new book that I found really fascinating was the description of some of the sacred pilgrimage site or Pure Land, and that some of the goddesses there could actually be plants. Or
yes,
that just intuitively made sense to me. Yeah,
absolutely, all plants. The dakinis which were found were plants, and it was also thought that the dakinis guarded these plants, and the dakinis gave you visions after you've eaten the plants. So the meaning of Kandroma or Dakini is multifarious, and it depends exactly what you're talking about, what the word Dakini means.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating concept. The female wisdom, deity, sky dancer, but yeah, it could be the plants. It could be.
And they're often, I mean, for me anyway, Dakinis are often characters in my dreams, and that give me important teachings. But I believe this is only available to you after you've done the meditations on the Dakinis, done their mantras for some years, and then they will eventually appear in your dreams.
Yeah, I guess I'll just it's just interesting for me to note that whatever role psychedelics played in the history of Vajrayana Buddhism, it's just interesting how that seems like it's been the most secret part of the tradition, perhaps. So it must be cultural reasons for that, right? I mean, there's no.
Yes.
Just notice. I think we're in a new time where there's value in less secrecy and more transparency, and I'm actually a fan of that. So.
Right.
Yeah. Well, fascinating. It's been amazing talking to you. This is a great conversation. I think it has a lot of helpful tips for people. It's not just theoretical. Anything else you want to share with us?
Not really. I can't think of any gnomic utterances that will hit the nail on the head right now.
I guess I'm just thinking that we're in a difficult. I mean, I guess everyone, maybe every time period says this, but here we are, 2024. There's a lot of war in the world. There's a lot of problems in our world. There's all these environmental catastrophes looming over us. And I really do believe that meditation and the teachings of Buddhism can be a help. And I think psychedelics can be a part of the solution to shifting because from the Buddhist point of view, all these outward problems are actually creations of our own minds, right? It's because of our ignorance that we're creating.
Right.
So,
in particular, they're a product of the ignorance of our leaders' minds, people who you might not, I might not see as leaders, but people who assume control of a country and then empower a few thousand people to be a member of their army or Air Force, Navy, and what have you, and attack another country. Well, if you have the Buddhist teachings and have those at your heart, you've really taken them to mind, you're not going to participate in any of that. And I just hope that more and more people will wake up and find their kinship with all beings, with all members of the human society, and all animals and other beings too.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's not part of the inspiring part of this conversation for me is I think it's not enough just to feel a sense of kinship with all other humans. We need to include the animals, the plants, the environment. It's just
totally, yes.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was a really rich conversation.
Well, you're welcome.